In this video we are going to talk about IPAM on Windows Server 2016. And first, a couple of general information. IPAM as a feature first came out in Windows Server starting with Windows Server 2012, and it has seen much improvement in Windows Server 2012 R2 and a further improvement in Windows Server 2016. IPAM is a free solution for IP address management offered by Microsoft, and with it you can manage different things related to networking like IP address blocks, DHCP scopes, DNS entries, and so on. It is easy to set up and manage because it is actually integrated in the server manager, and it also offers a lot of PowerShell commandlets, especially in Windows Server 2016. In 2016, a lot of improvements have been made to DNS management, because now you can manage your zones and your resource records, which you could not do in the past. When we talk about IPAM, we are actually talking about 5 primary functions under which all of the IPAM features are categorized. So the first major function is address space management, and this means that with IPAM you can manage your address space, your physical address space. So meaning you will manage your subnets, your address blocks, everything that has to do with IP address management. The second point is sort of tied to the first one, because starting with Windows Server 2012 R2, in IPAM you can also manage all of your networks that you have in VMM. So you can connect your virtual machine management infrastructure with IPAM and manage everything from VMM in your IPAM console. The next point, multi-server discovery, management and monitoring, means that with IPAM you don't just manage IP address space, you also manage the DHCP servers, the DNS servers, for example. You can create scopes, you can modify DHCP options, you can create DNS zones, and so on. And of course you can also monitor that your DHCP service is running, that your DNS zones are healthy, and much more. In the audit part, IPAM collects a lot of events that pertain to DHCP configuration, to IPAM configuration, to IP address assignment, to user logon, and so on. And with all these events, then you can use the IPAM console to view a lot of data. So you can view which IP address has been granted where, which user has logged on where, and so on. The last point is actually very important, especially for bigger companies. It's role-based access control, and this is a new feature in Windows Server 2012, which has been enhanced in Windows Server 2016. With role-based access control, you can grant really granular roles to different users or groups on different parts of your IPAM infrastructure. Let's also talk about where IPAM keeps all of its data. In Windows Server 2012 you had the option to place the IPAM data in a Windows internal database, which changed in Windows Server 2012 R2, which also lets you put your data in a Microsoft SQL Server database. This is the same in Windows Server 2016. The space that the database will take up really depends on your environment complexity, because as you have more IP ranges, more IP addresses that are granted, more devices and so on, of course the database will be bigger. If you want to get an idea of how much space you might need according to your environment, please check the link that I have placed in this presentation. By the way, the presentation can be found in my GitHub repository that is linked in the description. And with this link, you might be able to much thoroughly approximate how much space you will actually need. Talking about space, one good thing about IPAM is that old event data can be deleted very easily by using the graphical interface of IPAM, just by specifying a date and deleting every event that is older than that date. When using IPAM, I consider that two things are very important to know and understand. What is an address block and what is an address range? An address block is just a container for a big block of IP addresses, from which then we can create different ranges. Usually a block is a well-known IP network, like for example 172.16.0.0/16. Now an address range is a subset of a block, which can be represented, for example, by a DHCP scope or by an IPAM managed address range. An example might be 172.16.0.1 to 172.16.0.100, and this might be, for example, a DHCP scope. Let's see a couple of more things about IPAM. With all of the things that IPAM can do, I'm happy to tell you that IPAM is completely agentless, so you don't have to install anything on any of the servers that you manage. IPAM does not need it. Most of the tasks that are done are actually done with different scripts or programs that are run as scheduled tasks. As far as management goes, IPAM can manage only Microsoft technologies, so Microsoft DHCP or DNS, for example, and can go from Windows Server 2008 and up. If you already have a complex infrastructure and maybe you have a lot of data about all of your IPs, you don't have to worry, because IPAM lets you import and also export data either via the GUI or via PowerShell. And this is nice because it permits integration with other tools. The IPAM server itself has a couple of local groups with which you can grant users roles in IPAM, but of course this is a very simple solution that was used in Windows Server 2012, because now in IPAM we also have the role-based access control, which is more granular. And talking about role-based access control, I wanted to tell you a little more about it, as it's really an important feature if you really need it. So, in a role-based access control, there are two things that we need to know. What is a user role and what is an access scope. So IPAM uses roles and scopes and policies to allow you to define fine-grained control for users and groups for different objects in your IPAM infrastructure. Roles are IPAM operations, like deleting an IP or creating an IP. Windows Server 2016 has 8 already built in, but you can define as many roles as you need. Access scopes define the objects that a user has access to. So you could say that they define the administrative domain. An example that I can think of is that you would create groups for your different locations that you have in your environment, and like this you would be able to only permit the DHCP administrators from New York to manage only the DHCP servers from New York. And what I explained here goes actually into the access policies, because when we combine a role, meaning the possibility to create a new DNS entry, for example, then when we combine the role with a scope, we get that fine-grained control that I was talking about. Before we go on, let's have a graphical representation of how IPAM works and what an address block and address range actually mean. First, let's talk about IPAM. And you can see here I have an IPAM 01 server and a DC and a DHCP server. On the IPAM 01, I will now install the IPAM feature. IPAM is installed. And I will, let's say that I will use its internal Windows database. It's okay from my point of view. Now when we install IPAM, we select a database. We will also select the way that we want new servers to be added as managed servers. This means that we have to specify how the connection settings to the managed servers will apply, because some firewall rules have to be created before servers can be managed. Most of the times you will choose, of course, group policy because it's easier. And when you install IPAM, you will also have to create, through IPAM, free group policies in your Active Directory environment. Okay, one group policy will be for DC, one for DNS, and one for DHCP. And in this moment, IPAM will start and discover servers from your environment, and it will of course find these two servers here, the domain controller and the DHCP server. After they are discovered, we have to choose to manage them. And as soon as we choose that these two servers will be managed, what will actually happen is that the correct group policies will be applied to the servers that have the specific services on them. So these two will apply only to the first one, and the DHCP will apply to the second one. After we wait a while for these policies to configure the servers, or we issue a GP update force, then IPAM will be fully capable of managing them. And from now on, the database will start to be populated with IP addresses, with ranges, with events, and so on. The next topic I want to quickly cover is the difference between an IP address block and an IP address range. Let's create a block, and this block will be 192.168.1.0/24. In IPAM we have this address block, and we have in our environment a DHCP server. This means we also have an IP address range. The DHCP server gives IP addresses from 1 to 100. This means that from this address block, we will carve ourselves an address range that goes from 1.1 to 1.100. So this part of the block now is consumed by the DHCP scope. This is an IP address range. From 101 to 200, we may have IP addresses that we want to assign manually ourselves, so not with DHCP. But even though we assign them manually, it's a good idea that we know to who they are assigned and maybe other details. So we create a second address range, this one, that goes from 1.101 to 1.200. And the first one is a DHCP managed range. This one is an IPAM managed range. And we also have a couple of addresses left over that we could either add to our IPAM range, we could create another DHCP scope, or we could create a third range. It's our choice. But this is the relationship between a block and a range.